Now, as we've been hearing, Billy Wolfe was a huge figure in the history of Scottish nationalism and was in charge of the party during the 1970s when the SNP achieved its best ever performance in a UK election. Alex Salmond has said Mr Wolfe had, more than anyone, transformed the SNP into a modern political party. David Allison has this report.
There's no other party offering to...
Born in 1926, Billy Wolfe joined the SNP in 1959, becoming leader a decade later. It was during his leadership, when he focused on Scotland's oil reserves, that the party had its greatest UK electoral success.
The party is on the upswing, and the people of Scotland have been responding to us over the past year or so in increasing numbers.
A successful campaign during the October 74 general election won the SNP 11 Westminster seats, nicknamed the football team.
His tragedy is that when it came to the big breakthrough, he was not elected. At the critical time, when he was the chairman or leader of the party, he didn't get the opportunity of taking the leadership further.
He was forced to quit after the party's dismal performance in the 1979 general election, when they lost 9 seats and were left with just 2 MPs.
It was Billy who professionalised the party, and then, even more so, I think, said, look, the party needs a political identity as a social democratic Scottish party. And in both these things, he was extremely far-seeing. So what we have tonight, the SNP in government, owes an extraordinary amount to the work of Billy Wolfe.
Although he married a Catholic, he was accused of bigotry over his vocal opposition to the Pope's visit to Scotland in 1982. He later accepted he was wrong and in later life remained active in both the SNP and the campaign for nuclear disarmament. But he'll be most remembered for that famous result in '74, which remains the high watermark in terms of UK electoral success for the SNP.
Well, joining me live now from Aviemore, the Education Secretary Michael Russell, a former Chief Executive of the party, and the former SNP leader, John Swinney. John Swinney, first of all, what debt do you think the SNP owes Billy Wolfe?
I think the SNP owes Billy Wolfe a colossal debt, because in the many years before Billy Wolfe became active in the party, we had taken a number of very small steps forward. And in the period when Billy Wolfe was involved, from the 1960s onwards, we took giant steps ahead. And I think there's, literally, it's without question that the fact that we're now the Government of Scotland is built on the foundations established in the 1960s and 70s by the splendid example and leadership of Billy Wolfe.
We tend to think, Mike Russell, of the big SNP breakthrough in the 1960s being Winnie Ewing's victory in Hamilton, but Billy Wolfe had a victory of his own, of sorts, much earlier.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, he very nearly became the MP for West Lothian. But of course, the SNP was an extra-parliamentary party for most of its history. So the fact he never became an MP, an elected representative, didn't stop the enormous influence he had in the party and the ability he had to drive the party forward. And he did it in policy because he positioned the party broadly to the left of centre, which needed to be done. He did it in professional organisation. He was a businessman with a very professional touch. And he did it in one other way that I think is extremely significant. Essentially, West Lothian started to create Alex Salmond, the young Alex Salmond, as a politician. And very much Alec took forward Billy's professionalism, his communication skills, the left-of-centre positioning. So what we're doing here today, all of us owe a great deal to Billy, who was also the kindest of men, and who in politics, I think almost uniquely, was a man who everybody could admire and feel warm towards.
Just tell us, in terms of organisation, the difference that he made.
Well, he took on a lot of policy that was very outdated in the SNP in the 60s and changed it and had it changed and made sure that it was relevant. But he also knew that communication was extremely important. And in his first election, he had in his team a man called Angus MacGillivray, alas also dead, who became essentially his right-hand man in organising the party, producing materials. And Angus, when I became Chief Executive, was still the party's publications manager. He identified good people, he made sure the materials were good, he also made sure that the party was out campaigning, and he led from the front. So he was a professional. He had a very successful business. Tragically, I suspect the amount of time he put into politics was one of the reasons why that business didn't last. But he was an astute professional in everything he did.
Was he the right man, John Swinney, to lead the party in those years?
Without a doubt, and I think what Billy managed to do was to combine the very strong organisational foundations that were built up in the 1960s with an acute political sense about how the party had to be ambitious. And if you look back at the materials of the 1974 election campaigns, I think many of the themes and much of the sense and much of the appeal was very similar to the character of our message in 2007. It was hopeful, it was optimistic, it was about what we were able to do and what we could do as a country if we hoped for it and worked for it. And I certainly can remember, I was 10 in 1974, I can remember the campaign vehicles of the SNP going round Edinburgh with a message on the back of them, it's time for self-government. And that was a Billy Wolfe message with great aspiration and great optimism. I think it left an indelible mark on me because that connection became party membership for me a few years later. And I think the sense of great positive and constructive outlook that campaign enshrined was very much a creation of Billy's style and Billy's approach.
Was he lucky in the sense that Scotland struck oil in those years?
Well, obviously it helped the message enormously and it allowed a sense of a different perspective to be taken on Scotland's economic strength. But Billy was a man who was able to bring people to agreement, to bring people to points of working together that allowed us to have strong messages. And if you look at what Billy put together in the run-up to the 1974 election campaign, it was an immensely powerful team. It had the intellect of Gordon Wilson leading the oil campaign, it had the organisational depth and skill of Rosemary Hall, who was a most distinguished National Secretary of the party, very much motivated by Billy, and Angus MacGillivray, who was the practical engine behind the whole publicity machine. And Billy built a very strong campaigning team around that message and seized the opportunity. And of course, the real tragedy is that much of what Billy predicted in 1973 and 74 about the scale of the oil wealth that was there for Scotland was all denied. We were told that Billy had got his numbers wrong. And of course we know with the passage of time that Billy was absolutely right. It was the London parties that were talking nonsense. And Scotland had an oil bonanza that we haven't been able to use for our own benefit. And I suppose the challenge for those of us who now have the privilege to be part of the leadership of the SNP and the Scottish Government is to make sure we seize these opportunities now in the 21st century and complete the work that Billy Wolfe started for us with such distinction.
And Mike Russell, I'm right in thinking, am I, that the logo over your shoulder there was Billy Wolfe's idea too?
Well, yes. I mean, Billy takes the credit for, and rightly took the credit for, what was called, and he hated it being called this, so I'll get away with it now, the Clootie dumpling, because it was the original symbol for the SNP. And indeed, that has undergone variations over the years. John and I have been responsible over the years for some of the least successful variations of that, and it has returned as the symbol that everybody recognises. And that shows the fact that he understood some things which we didn't understand quite as well. But the great strength of Billy, above all, was essentially his humanity. He went through difficult times, he went through hard times, he was always outgoing, and he was the most self-knowledgeable man I have ever met. He was a man who understood where he had come from, the mistakes he'd made, the good things he'd done, and he will be missed in that way too. Everybody I've spoken today about him feels personally they have a loss.
Michael Russell and John Swinney, thank you very much indeed.